Welcome back, deep divers. You know the drill, right? We dust off a book, a manuscript, something people might have thought was too strange, too dangerous.
Lost of time.
Yeah, exactly. Lost to time, or maybe just hidden away, deliberately. And then we dive in,
At first.
headfirst, into the ideas, the history, the whole shebang. And today's episode is, well, it's a doozy. We're talking about the Gnostics and their remains. Forbidden origins, hidden symbols, all that good stuff.
Secret societies, too. Can't forget those.
Oh, right. The occult legacy. Sounds a bit ominous, doesn't it? This whole idea of the Gnostics,
Yeah.
secret knowledge, groups operating in the shadows. Like, were they really just misunderstood mystics? Or something? Something a little more, I don't
A
know.
little more subversive, maybe.
Yeah, subversive. That's the
Mhm.
word. But before we get all Dan Brown on this, let's back up. We're talking about early Christianity, right? But not the kind they teach in Sunday school.
Not exactly. We tend to think of early Christianity as this unified movement, but the reality was a lot more, let's say, diverse.
Diverse, huh?
Very much so. And that's where the Gnostics come in. They were part of this early Christian landscape, but with their own distinct interpretations and beliefs.
Like a separate branch on the old Christian tree.
A very unique branch, you could say, and they were quite adamant about their own authenticity. Our source mentions the Ophites.
The Ophites.
Yes, an early Gnostic group. They actually claimed to be the only true Christians, the only ones who truly grasped the nature of the Savior.
Wow, talk about confidence. So what made them so different?
Well, for one thing, Gnosticism wasn't just some isolated, internally developed system. They actively engaged with other intellectual and spiritual traditions of their time.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
The text mentions their interest in ancient mystery cults, the Eleusinian and Phrygian rites, for instance.
You know, like those secret initiations, I've read a little bit about them.
Right, and the Gnostics saw them not as rivals, but as precursors, foreshadowing the coming of Christ, in a way.
Hmm.
They also took a very spiritualized approach to Greek and Roman mythology, seeing allegorical meanings where others saw just, stories about gods and heroes.
So they were weaving together threads from all these different traditions, a real syncretic approach, right?
Exactly. They were blending and reinterpreting elements to create their own unique understanding of the divine and humanity's place in the cosmos. But, despite this vibrant start, Gnosticism in Europe didn't really last. By the 6th century, it had largely faded as a major force.
What happened? Did they just sort of disappear?
Not entirely. The rise of what we now call Catholic Christianity, with its emphasis on doctrinal unity and a centralized authority, that played a significant role.
So the Gnostics lost out in the battle for, I guess, religious dominance?
You could put it that way.
Hmm.
But it's important to note that Gnosticism didn't vanish completely. It continued to exist in parts of Asia for centuries until the spread of Islam.
Interesting. So even though their formal structures faded in Europe, their ideas kept circulating.
Precisely. Their influence persisted, especially in the writings and symbolism used by, let's say, less mainstream figures, magicians, astrologers, alchemists, those sorts of folks, throughout the Middle Ages.
So like a hidden stream flowing beneath the surface.
A very apt metaphor. Now let's delve into some of the specific Gnostic concepts. The text delves into their terminology, and it seems even St. Paul had some reservations about the kind of language they were using.
Oh, really? What did he say?
Well, he warned against vain discourses and new coined appellations. Like, he was a bit wary of fancy words that didn't have real substance behind them. But here's the kicker. Paul himself used language that would later become central to Gnostic expression.
Wait, so he criticized them for using language he himself was using. That's ironic. What kind of phrases are we talking about?
For example, the idea of being dead in error and in sins, walking according to the eon of this world. And then there's the archon, who has dominion of the air, which is identified with the Gnostic demiurge, Ildabaoth.
Okay, hold on. Archon. Demiurge. Lots of new words here. Let's break it down. What exactly is an archon in the Gnostic worldview?
In essence, archons are spiritual beings, often associated with the creation of the material world. But unlike the benevolent creator god of traditional Christianity, in Gnostic thought, they're often seen as flawed, even malevolent entities, They're the ones who keep humanity trapped in ignorance.
So not exactly the good guys. And this demiurge, that's basically their leader, right?
In many Gnostic systems, yes. Ildebaoth is a prime example. And the fact that Paul used similar language suggests a shared vocabulary or perhaps a shared understanding of these spiritual forces at play.
So maybe they weren't so different after all, at least in some respects.
It's a fascinating point. And the parallels don't end there. The author draws a comparison with the Zoroastrian devs. These beings who, according to Zoroastrian belief, fill the air, deceive, and lead humanity into temptation.
Yeah.
Very similar to the Gnostic concept of archons, wouldn't you say?
Definitely a recurring theme.
Right.
And then there's that passage from Paul about spiritual warfare, where he talks about battling not against flesh and blood, but against dominions, powers, lords of darkness, the malevolence of spirits in the upper regions. That sounds pretty Gnostic to me.
Absolutely. And the author points out that these are regular terms in both Gnostic and Kabbalistic writings.
So this idea of a hierarchical cosmos populated by all these different spiritual beings, it wasn't unique to Gnosticism.
Right. It suggests a broader spiritual worldview that resonated with other mystical and philosophical systems of the time. Now, speaking of the cosmos, the concept of emanations is pretty central to how Gnostics understood creation.
Emanations. Fill me in.
Well, instead of a direct single act of creation by a god, Gnosticism describes the universe as unfolding through a series of emanations. Think of them as divine sparks, or aspects, proceeding from an ultimate transcendent source. This source is often considered unknowable, beyond human comprehension.
So it's like a cascade of divine energy flowing outwards and creating the world as we know it.
That's a good way to put it. And it's actually quite similar to ideas found in other traditions. The author draws an analogy with Buddhist theosophy, for example.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, in Nepalese Buddhism, you have the figure of Padmapani, who gives rise to Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the three major deities. And the author suggests that this is strikingly similar to the Ophite diagramma.
The Ophite diagramma.
It's a key diagram in Ophite Gnosticism, depicting the emanation of various divine beings from the ultimate source.
So essentially, two different traditions, separated by vast distances, arrive at a similar way of understanding the origin of the cosmos.
Precisely. It points to potential shared philosophical roots, or perhaps universal archetypes that find expression in different cultural contexts.
Fascinating. And then there's this recurring Gnostic theme of divine light being trapped within the material world.
Right. The idea that our true spiritual essence, this spark of divinity, is imprisoned within matter and yearns to return to its source.
So it's like a story of exile and the longing for return.
Exactly. And we see this reflected in a number of Gnostic texts, like the Ophite idea of Achamoth extracting light from Ildebaoth and his sons, or the Pistis Sophia, which describes angels gathering light from the rebellious eons of the zodiacal sphere.
It's a pretty epic struggle, cosmic in scale.
It is, and you find similar ideas in other traditions as well. The Kabbalistic concept of the Supreme delivering spirits in Asia from their material envelope and strengthening the ray of light within them, that's a great example. Now, what about the human soul in all of this? How do the Gnostics view that?
Yeah, what's the Gnostic take on the soul?
Well, they saw it as a composite entity, made up of elements from different realms. There's the nephesh, associated with physical life, the ruach, with the emotional and volitional aspects, the nesha, linked to intellect and reason, and then the chaya, representing the higher spiritual life.
So it's like we're made up of different layers, each originating from a different spiritual sphere.
Precisely. The human being as a microcosm of the larger cosmos.
Oh.
But it gets even more complex. The text talks about the inner man, which is said to be constituted by rebellious eons.
Rebellious eons? Like what?
Entities like power, soul from tears, counterfeit of the spirit, and fate.
So basically, we've got all these different forces, both internal and external, pulling us in different directions.
Exactly. It reflects the Gnostic view of the human condition as one of fundamental alienation from the divine. And this exile, this separation, is often attributed to a primordial event, the sin of the first man.
Adam and Eve, right?
Yes. But in Gnostic thought, it goes even deeper. They believe that the soul of the first man contained all subsequent souls at the time of the fall.
So we're all carrying the weight of that original sin, so to speak.
In a way, yes. And this exile into material bodies is seen as a form of expiation, a necessary step on the path back to the divine source.
Okay, so we've talked about the Gnostic worldview, their cosmology, their understanding of the soul. But what about the texts? What were some of the key writings that shaped Gnostic thought?
Well, there are a number, but one that's particularly interesting is the Book of Enoch.
The Book of Enoch, I've heard of it. It's not exactly your standard biblical fare, is it?
No, it's not. It was actually excluded from the canonical scriptures,
Yeah.
but it was deeply influential in Gnostic circles.
What's it about?
It's full of fascinating stories and revelations. Fallen angels, giants, Enoch's prophetic visions of judgment and cosmic upheaval. It even includes an account of the Great Flood.
Talk about epic storytelling.
And there's a passage about stars who disobeyed divine commands and are imprisoned until their crimes are complete.
Wow, so even the stars aren't immune to rebellion and punishment.
It paints a vivid picture of a universe governed by divine law and the consequences of transgression. Now, another key Gnostic text is the Pistis Sophia.
Pistis Sophia, what does that mean?
It translates roughly as faith wisdom, and it's considered a core scripture in many Gnostic traditions.
What kind of insights does it offer?
Well, it focuses on the Savior's teachings and revelations to his closest disciples, Mary Magdalene, Salome, even his earthly mother.
So it's like an insider's perspective on Jesus' teachings.
You could say that, but it also contains some rather unusual elements. For instance, we find Jesus engaging in these very lengthy prayers with complex formulae, and there's a distinctive ritual involving a sacrifice of wine and water.
That's interesting. What else?
Well, there are detailed teachings about the influence of zodiacal eons and planets on newborns, and it even incorporates Magian sacred names and references to Egyptian and Syrian deities like Barbello.
So it's a real blend of different religious and cosmological ideas. A bit of a head spinner, to be honest.
It can be. But that reflects the syncretic nature of Gnosticism. They were drawing from a variety of sources to create their own unique spiritual synthesis.
And this idea of opposed dualism, that seems to run through a lot of Gnostic thought.
Yes. The tension between light and darkness, spirit and matter, good and evil, it's a recurring motif in their writings. And you see it reflected in figures like the obedient and rebellious Adamus, or the contrasting figures of the great and little Sabbath.
So it's not just a simple good versus evil dichotomy. It's more nuanced than that.
Much more nuanced. It's about the interplay of these opposing forces within the cosmos and within ourselves. And this brings us to another intriguing aspect of Gnosticism, their connection to what we might call the occult.
Okay, so let's talk about that. The occult legacy of the Gnostics. The book mentions how early Christianity itself was often perceived as a form of magic, in part due to its association with Gnosticism.
Right. Back then, the lines between religion, magic, and what we now call the occult were a lot blurrier.
Like, what would be considered magical in that context?
Well, the text mentions a story from Dio Cassius about a Christian legion that supposedly produced rain through prayer. To outsiders, that would have seemed like a magical feat.
I can see why. And apparently, even within the church itself, different factions would accuse each other of using magic.
Exactly. The Arians, for example, accused Athanasius of using magical practices, so it was a charge that got thrown around quite a bit.
So maybe it wasn't just about the practices themselves, but also about who was using them and for what purpose.
That's a good point. And the Gnostics, with their emphasis on spiritual beings and esoteric knowledge, they were often seen as particularly prone to dabbling in the occult.
Right, they were big on angels, weren't they?
Very much so. And they believed in the power of talismans, often depicting angels, to invoke their protection or guidance.
So they were tapping into the power of these spiritual beings, but in a way that might seem like magic to outsiders.
Precisely. And the author draws a connection here to the Magian schools founded by figures like Zoroaster and Moses, or Jambres, depending on the source. These schools were known for their knowledge of astrology, astronomy, and theurgy.
Theurgy?
It's basically the practice of ritual magic aimed at communicating with or invoking deities.
Okay, so we're talking about real magical practices here.
Yes, and the text provides some interesting examples, like the idea of sleeping with specific talismans under your pillow to induce desired dreams.
I've heard of that, like using a gem with a man on a plow to dream of treasure.
Exactly. It highlights the practical dimension of these beliefs, the idea that the spiritual realm could be directly accessed and manipulated to influence the material world. And speaking of magical practices, there's also the mention of the Mark of Mithras.
Mithras, as in the Roman mystery cult.
The very same. It was a form of initiation in the Mithraic mysteries, and some scholars believe it may have influenced later Christian concepts of spiritual marking.
Like in St. Augustine and the Book of Revelation.
Exactly. And the text points out that similar practices of bodily marking can be found in other traditions as well, particularly in India.
So this idea of using symbolic markings for spiritual purposes, it seems to have been quite widespread. Now, another key aspect of any religious or spiritual system is its approach to sin and redemption. What was the Gnostic take on that?
Well, they certainly had their own unique views on the matter. Our source mentions specific mysteries like baptism and the mysteries of the three courts, the first mystery, and the ineffable one. These are all described in the Pistis Sophia.
Okay, break it down for me. How did they view salvation?
They saw baptism as a kind of fiery purification, a process that consumes sins. But they also believed in higher mysteries that went beyond mere forgiveness.
Okay, what do you mean?
These higher mysteries were thought to actually prevent the future imputation of sins. It was about achieving a state of spiritual perfection where you were no longer subject to the cycle of sin and suffering.
So it was a more proactive approach to salvation. Like you're not just passively waiting for God to forgive you, you're actively working to transcend the whole concept of sin.
Exactly. And this emphasis on esoteric knowledge and specific rituals as the path to liberation, that's a hallmark of Gnostic thought.
It definitely sets them apart from more mainstream forms of Christianity.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about symbolism. The Gnostics were big on symbolism, right?
Absolutely. Their writings are full of symbolic language and imagery, often drawn from a variety of sources.
Give me an example.
Well, the text mentions a passage from Dante's Paradiso, where an eagle is formed from the letters in the constellation Jupiter. And the author points out the potential Gnostic significance of the numbers 5 and 7 within that passage.
So even centuries later, we're still finding echoes of Gnostic ideas in Western literature and art.
It speaks to their enduring influence, even if it's often subtle and hidden beneath the surface. And then there's Dante's cryptic reference to B and ICE.
Which some interpret as simply the initials of Beatrice, Dante's beloved.
Right, but the author suggests that it could have a deeper, hidden meaning, perhaps a password or a clue to some esoteric teaching.
Like a secret code waiting to be deciphered. Very intriguing. Now, what about the Gnostic use of Egyptian symbolism?
Well, that's particularly interesting given the historical context. Alexandria, which was a major center of Gnostic thought, was also a melting pot of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman cultures.
So it makes sense that they would incorporate elements of Egyptian religion and symbolism into their own system.
Exactly. And the text delves into a fascinating analysis of Apuleius' description of the procession of Isis.
Isis, the Egyptian goddess.
Yes. Apuleius describes this elaborate procession with all these different symbols and rituals. And the author suggests that some of these symbols might have held specific meanings for the Gnostics.
Like what?
Well, there's the udder-shaped vessel, for instance, which some have interpreted as vase of sins, but the author argues that it might have actually represented an irrigating pot, symbolizing fertility and abundance.
Interesting. What else?
Well, there's the winnow fan, which was often associated with marriage and Bacchus, and the golden bowl, which likely held a lamp, symbolizing light and knowledge.
So they were reinterpreting existing symbols and giving them new meanings within their own system.
Exactly. And then there's this mysterious image that's carried in the procession. It's described as being neither bird, beast, nor man.
Okay, so what was it?
Well, the author speculates that it might have been an early representation of Abraxas.
Abraxas. That's a name that pops up a lot in Gnostic texts.
It does, and it's often connected to the Egyptian god Iao. And interestingly enough, there are descriptions of a bronze statuette of Iao with a cock's head and serpent legs, which aligns perfectly with typical Abraxas iconography.
So it's another example of the Gnostics blending Egyptian and Greek elements into their own unique symbolic language.
Right. And speaking of symbols, we can't forget about the serpent.
Ah, yes, the serpent, the ultimate symbol of temptation and evil, at least in traditional Christianity.
For the Gnostics, the serpent held a much more complex and often reversed meaning.
Reversed. So they saw the serpent as a good thing.
In some cases, yes. In certain Gnostic systems, the serpent represents the true and perfect serpent who guides souls towards salvation.
Okay, that's a pretty radical reinterpretation.
It is, and it reflects their tendency to challenge traditional religious interpretations and to see things from a different perspective.
Like flipping the script on its head. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm curious about the broader impact of Gnosticism. How did their ideas influence later belief systems and practices?
Well, that's a complex question, but the text does offer some intriguing connections.
Okay, I'm all ears.
For example, there's a fascinating comparison between the Indian god Yama, who is the Lord of the Dead, and the Egyptian god Serapis, who was later associated with Christ.
That's a pretty big leap, geographically and culturally.
It is. But the similarities in their roles, their epithets, even their symbolic animal associations are quite striking.
Like dogs, for instance, which are associated with both Yama and Serapis.
Exactly. So it suggests that either there was some historical cross-influence between these traditions, or that there are certain universal archetypes that find expression in different cultures.
It's always fascinating to uncover those kinds of connections. What else?
Well, there's also the Gnostic connection with the evil eye superstition.
The evil eye. I've definitely heard of that.
It's a belief that's found in many cultures around the world, and the Gnostics were definitely familiar with it. The author quotes Heliodorus, who explains how envy can transmit a malignant property through the air and eyes,
So it's not just a superstition, there's an actual mechanism at work.
at least according to Heliodorus. And of course, there's the use of amulets to ward off the evil eye, which is something that the Gnostics also practiced.
Speaking of amulets, the book mentions a jade celt with Gnostic inscriptions.
Yes, that's a particularly fascinating object. It has this wreath-like design with leaves and ribbons, and on these ribbons are inscribed various holy names: Abraxas, Iao, Oblana, Gabriel, and a whole bunch of others. And there are vowel combinations on the ribbons as well, which suggests connection to Gnostic numerology.
It sounds beautiful.
It is. And what makes it even more interesting is that the celt itself is made of jade, which is a material that was already ancient in Gnostic times. It might have even been a Neolithic tool originally.
So they were taking something old and imbuing it with new meaning.
Exactly. And it highlights their fascination with the power of names and numbers. The author points out their references to the Pythagorean tetrad and Ogdoad, which further underscores this interest.
And then there's a depiction of the naked woman, Venus Anadyomene, on Gnostic monuments.
Right. That's often interpreted as a symbol of the revelation of truth, particularly to the Gnostic teacher Marcus.
It sounds like they had a very rich and multifaceted symbolic language.
They did. And it drew from a wide range of sources, creating a truly unique and complex system of thought.
Okay, so final question. What about the Gnostics' connection to secret societies? I mean, that's in the title of the book.
Right. And it's a topic that's often fraught with speculation and conspiracy theories. But the author is careful to distinguish between potential indirect links and direct historical lineages.
Okay, so what are some of those potential links?
Well, there are groups like the Rosicrucians, for example, who emerged centuries later.
The Rosicrucians, they were all about secret knowledge and spiritual transformation, right?
Exactly. And they claim to have ancient origins, tracing their lineage back to Damascus. And their beliefs incorporated elements of Pythagoreanism, alchemy, and other esoteric traditions.
So there are definitely some thematic resonances with Gnosticism there. What about the Freemasons?
Well, the historical origins of Freemasonry are a subject of much debate. But the oldest extant document on Masonry actually reveals a much more practical and non-secretive organization than the popular image suggests.
Okay, so not the Illuminati pulling strings from the shadows.
Not quite. The earliest Masonic lodges seem to have been more like guilds of stonemasons, concerned with the practical aspects of their craft. They were regulated by local authorities and didn't have the same aura of secrecy that we associate with Freemasonry today.
Interesting. So the modern perception of Freemasonry might be quite different from its historical reality.
It seems so. But that doesn't mean there aren't any potential connections to earlier traditions. The author mentions the existence of Mason's marks on ancient and medieval structures.
Mason's marks, what are those?
They're basically symbols or signatures that were carved into stones by individual masons.
Like a way of identifying their work.
Exactly. And some scholars believe that these marks might have had symbolic or even religious significance, potentially linking back to earlier traditions like Gnosticism.
So it's another example of those subtle echoes and continuities that run through the history of Western esotericism.
It is. And it suggests that while we may not be able to trace a direct line from the Gnostics to modern secret societies, the influence of their ideas and their fascination with hidden knowledge has definitely left a lasting mark.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've explored the Gnostics' diverse origins, their unique theological concepts, their intriguing engagement with other ancient traditions, and their enduring, if often hidden, impact on Western thought.
And it really underscores the importance of looking beyond the surface, of delving into these feared books and uncovering the richness and complexity of the ideas they contain.
It's a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems. There are always layers of meaning waiting to be discovered, and that's what makes exploring these topics so rewarding.
Absolutely. And speaking of exploration, I think it's time for our listeners to do some exploring of their own. What do you think?
I agree. I'm going to leave our listeners with a question. Considering the Gnostic emphasis on inner knowledge and their critique of established authority, how might these ancient ideas resonate with contemporary seekers of truth and meaning? It's something to ponder. Until next time, keep diving.
Happy diving.